She was 17 years old, with her whole life spread out before her like an unwrapped gift, and someone decided she didn't deserve to live it. For 55 years, Sandra Young existed only as a question mark. A cold case file gathering dust in a basement somewhere. A faded photograph that fewer and fewer people recognized with each passing decade. A name that detectives would occasionally stumble upon, shake their heads at, and close the folder. Unsolvable, they said. Too much time has passed, they said. The witnesses are dead, the evidence is degraded, and whoever did this is probably in the ground by now anyway. They were wrong. I want you to lean in close for this one, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just another true crime story. This is a resurrection. This is proof that the dead can speak if you're willing to listen hard enough. This is the story of how a teenage girl, silenced for more than half a century, finally got to tell the world who killed her. And I promise you, you won't see the ending coming. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever felt like justice takes too long, if you've ever wondered whether the truth really does come out in the end, if you've ever lost hope that the guilty will face consequences, then this story is meant for you. Share it. Subscribe to this channel. Because stories like Sandra's deserve to be heard by millions, not dozens. And the only way that happens is if you help carry her voice forward. Do it now, before you forget. I'll wait. Now let me take you back to the late 1960s. Picture a small American town, the kind where everybody knows everybody else's business, or at least they think they do. The Vietnam War is playing out on television screens every evening. The Beatles are on the radio. Young people are growing their hair long and questioning everything their parents took for granted. It's a time of revolution and rebellion, of hope and horror existing side by side. Sandra Young was a child of this era, though she didn't consider herself particularly revolutionary. She was a junior in high school, popular enough to have friends, but not so popular that she attracted envy. She had brown hair that she liked to wear in a flip, the fashionable style of the time, and she had a laugh that her mother would later describe as the sound of pure joy. Sandra worked part-time at a local diner, saving money for a future she talked about constantly. She wanted to be a nurse. She'd decided this at age 12 when she'd broken her arm falling off her bicycle, and a kind woman in white had held her hand through the whole ordeal, making her feel safe when she was terrified. That's what Sandra wanted to do. She wanted to hold people's hands through the worst moments of their lives and help them come out the other side. Her family was modest but loving. Her father worked at a manufacturing plant, putting in long hours to provide for his wife and 3 children. Sandra was the middle child, sandwiched between an older brother who had just been drafted and a younger sister who worshipped the ground she walked on. Her mother was a homemaker in an era when that term still carried pride, a woman who kept an immaculate house and believed fiercely in the promise of her children's futures. The Youngs weren't wealthy, but they were rich in the ways that mattered. They ate dinner together every night. They went to church on Sundays. They trusted their neighbors and left their doors unlocked and believed that bad things happened somewhere else, to other people, in big cities where crime festered. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. On the night Sandra Young disappeared, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was a Thursday evening, mild for the season, with the kind of clear sky that makes you believe tomorrow will be good. Sandra had finished her shift at the diner around 8 o'clock, the same as always. She'd counted her tips, tucked them into her purse, and said goodnight to the cook. Multiple witnesses saw her leave through the front door. The neon sign of the diner reflected in the window as she passed, painting her face in alternating shades of red and blue. She turned left toward home, a walk of roughly 15 minutes that she'd made hundreds of times before. She never arrived. Her mother started worrying around 9:30. By 10, she'd called the diner to see if Sandra had stayed late. By 11, she'd telephoned every friend whose number she could find. By midnight, Sandra's father was driving through the streets of town, calling his daughter's name into the darkness. The police were notified the next morning. In those days, there was no Amber Alert, no immediate mobilization, no understanding that the first 48 hours of a disappearance were critical. The officers who took the report were sympathetic, but not particularly urgent. Teenagers sometimes ran off, they said. She probably had a boyfriend her parents didn't know about. Give it a day or two, and she'd come home with her tail between her legs. Sandra's mother knew her daughter better than any police officer could. She knew Sandra wasn't the type to run off. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. She was right. 3 weeks later, a farmer found Sandra's body in a ditch at the edge of his property, hidden beneath a layer of leaves and debris. She had been strangled. The condition of her body made identification difficult, but her mother knew the moment she saw the delicate gold chain around the neck, the one with the tiny cross that Sandra had received for her 16th birthday. The medical examiner determined that Sandra had died within hours of her disappearance, which meant that while her parents were calling her friends, while her father was driving through empty streets, their daughter was already gone. She had been taken from them in the span of a 15-minute walk, and they hadn't even known it. The investigation that followed was, by modern standards, heartbreakingly inadequate. There was no DNA testing in the 1960s. Forensic science was in its infancy. The evidence collected from Sandra's body was limited, and what was collected was stored improperly. Potential witnesses were interviewed, but nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything. The path Sandra walked was residential, quiet, and apparently unobserved. The police focused their suspicion on several individuals, including a local man with a history of peeping Tom complaints and an ex-boyfriend who Sandra had stopped seeing a few months prior. Both had alibis that were flimsy but not breakable. Without physical evidence to tie anyone to the crime, the investigation stalled. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And Sandra Young became a cold case. The Young family was never the same after Sandra's murder. How could they be? A family is like a tapestry, each member a thread woven into the larger pattern, and when one thread is violently torn away, the whole fabric begins to unravel. Sandra's father threw himself into the investigation with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He quit his job at the plant and spent his days following leads, interviewing anyone who would talk to him, and pestering the police department for updates that never came. He became a fixture at the station, showing up so often that the officers began to avoid him. They didn't know what to tell him. They had nothing. The guilt ate at him in ways he couldn't articulate. He was her father. He was supposed to protect her. He was supposed to keep her safe from the monsters of the world. And he had failed in the most fundamental way possible. On the night Sandra disappeared, he had been home watching television, half asleep in his recliner, while someone was stealing his daughter's life. He would never forgive himself for that. Sandra's mother processed her grief differently. Where her husband became manic, she became still. She stopped leaving the house. She stopped answering the phone. She kept Sandra's bedroom exactly as it had been on the day of her disappearance, a shrine to a future that would never arrive. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit on Sandra's bed and talk to her, telling her about the ordinary events of the day as if Sandra was simply away on a trip and would be home soon. The younger sister, barely 13 at the time of the murder, grew up in the shadow of her sister's death. She was haunted by survivor's guilt, by the irrational but persistent belief that it should have been her instead. She was the one who usually walked to the diner to visit Sandra after her shifts. On that particular night, she'd had homework and stayed home. If she'd gone, maybe she could have done something. Maybe her presence would have deterred the killer. Maybe she would have been taken too, but at least Sandra wouldn't have been alone. These thoughts followed her through adolescence and into adulthood. She married young, perhaps searching for safety, for the protection of belonging to someone. She had children of her own, but she could never quite shake the feeling that she was living a borrowed life, one that should have belonged to her sister. Sandra's older brother came home from Vietnam with wounds both visible and invisible. He'd received the news of his sister's death through a military telegram, cold words on thin paper that shattered his world while he was half a world away, unable to do anything, unable to comfort his family, unable to say goodbye. The war changed him, as it changed so many young men, but Sandra's murder changed him more. He came home quiet, withdrawn, and filled with a rage that had no outlet. He'd always been protective of his sisters. When he was drafted, he'd made Sandra promise to be careful, to stay safe, to not do anything stupid until he got back. She'd laughed at him, called him a worrywart. and hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. That hug was the last physical contact they ever had. He would carry the memory of it for the rest of his life. The feeling of her arms around him, the smell of her shampoo, the sound of her voice saying, "I love you. Be careful over there." The community tried to help, in the way that small communities do. Casseroles were delivered to the Young household in an endless parade. The church held prayer vigils. A reward fund was established, though the amount collected was modest and would remain unclaimed for decades. But small towns have short memories, and tragedy is uncomfortable to dwell upon. Within a year, life had returned to normal for most of the residents. The murder became something people mentioned in hushed tones, a cautionary tale told to teenagers to keep them from walking alone at night. But for the Young family, there was no moving on. There was no closure. Every birthday that Sandra would have celebrated, every milestone she would have reached, was a fresh wound. She would have graduated high school. She would have gone to nursing school. She would have married, perhaps, and had children. She would have been an aunt to her siblings' kids, the cool aunt who let them stay up late and eat too much candy. All of these possibilities had been stolen, not just from Sandra, but from everyone who loved her. The investigation continued in fits and starts over the years. Every few years, a new detective would pick up the file, review the evidence, and try to find something that had been missed. New technologies were developed. Fingerprinting became more sophisticated. Criminal profiling emerged as a discipline. But none of it was enough to crack Sandra's case. The original lead detective retired in 1978, having never solved what he considered the most important case of his career. He died in 1992, still wondering who had killed Sandra Young. The young officer who had taken the initial missing persons report eventually became police chief, and he made it his personal mission to keep Sandra's case open. But keeping a case open and actually solving it are two different things, and the years continued to pass without answers. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. Sandra's father died in 1985, his heart giving out after years of stress and grief. Some said he died of a broken heart, and that might not have been far from the truth. On his deathbed, he made his wife promise that she wouldn't give up, that she would keep pushing for justice even after he was gone. She promised, though she didn't know how she would keep that promise. She was tired, so very tired. Sandra's mother lived another decade, passing away in 1995. By then, she had outlived her husband, her daughter, and her hope. But she never forgot Sandra, and she never stopped talking about her. To the very end, she kept Sandra's bedroom untouched, a museum to a girl who would never age, never change, never come home. The siblings carried on the fight. The younger sister became an advocate for victims' families, channeling her grief into something productive. She spoke at conferences, lobbied for changes in how cold cases were handled, and made sure that Sandra's name was never forgotten. The brother remained in the background, supportive but unable to engage directly with the case. The war had taken too much from him, and Sandra's murder had taken whatever was left. Decades passed. The new millennium arrived. Technology advanced in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1960s. The internet connected the world. Cell phones became ubiquitous, and DNA technology revolutionized forensic science, solving cases that had seemed unsolvable for generations. But Sandra Young's case remained cold. The evidence from the original investigation had been improperly stored. Much of it had degraded beyond usefulness. What remained was questionable at best. Multiple attempts were made to extract DNA from the preserved samples, but the results were inconclusive. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, another name on the long list of victims who would never see justice. And then, in 2020, something changed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction, as breakthroughs often do. For years, genetic genealogy had been quietly revolutionizing cold case investigations. The process was complex but effective. Investigators would extract DNA from crime scene evidence, upload the genetic profile to public genealogy databases, and search for relatives of the unknown suspect. From there, they would build family trees, working forward through generations until they identified individuals who matched the profile, location, and age of the potential perpetrator. The method had solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018, and that success had opened the floodgates. Cold case units across the country began re-examining old evidence, hoping that modern technology could succeed where traditional investigation had failed. Sandra Young's case was selected for genetic genealogy investigation in early 2020. The decision was somewhat arbitrary. There were dozens of unsolved cases that deserved attention, and Sandra's was simply next in line. But for her surviving family members, it felt like fate, like the universe finally deciding it was time for the truth to emerge. The first step was to re-examine the physical evidence. After more than 50 years, there was precious little left. The original investigators had collected several items from the crime scene and from Sandra's body, but the storage methods of the 1960s were inadequate by modern standards. Many of the items had been contaminated or degraded beyond usefulness. But there was one piece of evidence that had survived the decades relatively intact: a cigarette, but found near Sandra's body. In the original investigation, the cigarette had been noted as potentially significant but ultimately inconclusive. Lots of people smoked in the 1960s. The butt could have been dropped by anyone, at any time, for any reason. Without DNA testing, there was no way to definitively link it to the crime. 55 years later, that cigarette became the key to everything. The genetic material extracted from the butt was partial, degraded, but sufficient for genetic genealogy analysis. The DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their genetic information in hopes of finding long-lost relatives. The search returned several matches, distant cousins of the unknown DNA contributor. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Really think about this before you answer. Do you believe that 55 years is too long to wait for justice? Or do you believe that justice delayed is still justice, that the truth matters even when decades have passed and the immediate pain has faded? Leave your answer in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know what you think. This question goes to the heart of why we tell these stories, why cold cases matter, why we don't simply forget and move on. From the genetic matches, investigators began to build a family tree. This was painstaking work, requiring months of research into birth records, death certificates, census data, and family histories. The genetic genealogists worked backward from the matches, identifying common ancestors, and then forward again through the generations, looking for individuals who would have been in the right place at the right time to commit the murder. The pandemic slowed the investigation but didn't stop it. Researchers worked from home, poring over digital records and conducting interviews via video call. Slowly, methodically, they narrowed the field of potential suspects. By late 2021, they had a name. Actually, they had several names, a handful of men who were the right age, who had lived in the right area, and who could not be immediately eliminated as suspects. Each of these individuals needed to be investigated further, their alibis checked, their life histories examined for any connection to Sandra Young. One by one, the suspects were eliminated. Some had alibis that checked out. Some had died and left no genetic material for comparison. Some had moved away from the area before the murder and could not be placed at the scene. But one name kept coming up again and again in the course of the investigation. One man whose history raised red flags. One man who had known Sandra Young personally, though the connection had never been explored in the original investigation. His name was Harold Mitchell. Harold Mitchell was 18 years old in the year Sandra was killed, just a year older than her. He had grown up in the same town, attended the same high school, and worked at the same diner where Sandra spent her after-school hours. According to employment records that had somehow survived the decades, Harold had been a busboy at the establishment for approximately 6 months, quitting abruptly about 2 weeks after Sandra's disappearance. This information had never come up in the original investigation. The diner's owner at the time had been interviewed, but he'd been asked about customers, not employees. Harold's brief employment had slipped through the cracks, unnoticed and unexamined. But there was more. Investigators discovered that Harold Mitchell had a history that stretched far beyond Sandra Young's murder. In 1975, he had been arrested for assault after attacking a woman in a parking lot. The woman had fought back, screamed for help, and escaped with her life. Harold was convicted and served 3 years in prison. In 1983, he was questioned but not charged in connection with another missing woman case in a neighboring state. That case was never solved. In 1991, he was arrested again, this time for stalking a coworker. He pled guilty to a lesser charge and received probation. The pattern was unmistakable. Harold Mitchell was a predator, and Sandra Young appeared to have been one of his earliest victims. But patterns aren't proof, and the investigators needed something more concrete. They needed to definitively match Harold's DNA to the cigarette but found at the crime scene. There was just one problem. Harold Mitchell was still alive. Harold Mitchell was 74 years old when investigators finally identified him as a suspect in Sandra Young's murder. He was living in a modest house in a suburb about 200 miles from the town where Sandra had died. He had been married twice, divorced twice, and had 2 adult children who rarely spoke to him. By all outward appearances, he was a lonely old man living out his final years in quiet obscurity. But appearances can be deceiving. The investigators faced a delicate challenge. They needed Harold's DNA to confirm their suspicions, but they didn't have enough evidence to compel him to provide a sample. If they approached him directly, he might lawyer up, destroy evidence, or disappear entirely. They needed to obtain his DNA surreptitiously, without his knowledge or consent. This practice, known as covert DNA collection, is legal in most jurisdictions, but ethically controversial. Essentially, investigators follow the suspect and collect genetic material that he discards voluntarily. A cigarette but thrown from a car window, a coffee cup left at a restaurant, a used napkin tossed in a trash can. Once the suspect abandons these items, they become fair game for DNA collection. For 3 weeks, an undercover team monitored Harold Mitchell's movements. They learned his routines, his habits, his preferences. They watched him go to the grocery store, the pharmacy, the occasional restaurant. They waited for an opportunity. That opportunity came at a fast food restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon. Harold ordered a coffee and a sandwich, sat alone at a table by the window, and spent about 30 minutes eating and looking at his phone. When he finished, he crumpled up his sandwich wrapper, placed his empty coffee cup on top of his tray, and carried the whole thing to the trash can. He dumped everything into the bin, walked out to his car, and drove away. 2 minutes later, an investigator entered the restaurant, retrieved the coffee cup from the top of the trash, and placed it in an evidence bag. The DNA extracted from the coffee cup was a match. Harold Mitchell's genetic profile was consistent with the DNA found on the cigarette, but at Sandra Young's murder scene. After 55 years, they had their killer. But the story doesn't end there. Identifying a suspect is one thing. Building a case that will stand up in court is another. The investigators knew that Harold's defense attorneys would challenge every aspect of the evidence. They would question the chain of custody for the original crime scene samples. They would argue that DNA evidence alone wasn't sufficient to prove guilt. They would claim that the cigarette but could have been deposited at the scene before or after the murder by coincidence rather than by the killer. The prosecution needed more. They needed to establish a connection between Harold and Sandra, a motive for the killing, and if possible, some form of corroboration for the physical evidence. And so the deeper investigation began. Investigators interviewed everyone they could find who had known Harold Mitchell in the 1960s. Most of his contemporaries had died, but a few remained, elderly now but still sharp enough to share their memories. What emerged was a portrait of a young man with a dark undercurrent beneath his surface charm. Harold, they said, had a temper. He was fine most of the time, friendly even, but something would set him off, and he'd become a different person entirely. Several former classmates recalled incidents where Harold had become violent over trivial slights, a perceived insult, a girl who rejected his advances, a teacher who criticized his work. And then there was the matter of Sandra herself. A woman who had worked at the diner in the late 1960s, now in her early 80s, remembered something that made the investigators' blood run cold. Harold, she said, had been obsessed with Sandra. He'd watched her constantly, found excuses to be near her, asked her out multiple times despite her repeated refusals. Sandra had complained about him to the other staff, saying he made her uncomfortable, saying there was something wrong with him. About 2 weeks before Sandra's disappearance, the woman recalled, there had been an incident. Harold had cornered Sandra in the storage room and tried to kiss her. She'd pushed him away and told him to leave her alone. Harold had become angry, his face twisting into something ugly, and for a moment the woman thought he was going to hit Sandra. But then he'd stormed off, and Sandra had emerged from the storage room shaking. The next day, Harold quit his job at the diner. 2 weeks later, Sandra was dead. This testimony, while powerful, was also problematic. The woman was elderly, and defense attorneys would inevitably question the reliability of memories that were more than 50 years old. But her account fit with what investigators already knew about Harold's patterns of behavior, and it provided crucial context for understanding why he might have targeted Sandra. The case was building, but slowly. Investigators continued to dig, looking for anything that might strengthen the prosecution's hand. They found it in the most unexpected place, Harold Mitchell's own family. Harold's eldest son, a man in his early 50s who had been estranged from his father for decades, agreed to speak with investigators. What he told them was devastating. His father, the son said, was a monster. He'd grown up in a household of fear, never knowing when his father's mood would turn violent. His mother had left when he was 12, fleeing in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back, and he'd always suspected there was more to the story than she would tell. After his parents divorced, he'd lived with his father for a few miserable years before escaping to college and never looking back. But the most significant thing the son revealed was a conversation he'd had with his father decades ago. They'd been watching a news report about a cold case being solved through DNA evidence. His father had become agitated, pacing the room, muttering that it was unfair, that things from the past should stay in the past, that people shouldn't have to pay for mistakes made when they were young. Then, in a moment of uncharacteristic candor, his father had said something that the son never forgot. I did something when I was 18 that could destroy my life if anyone ever found out. At the time, the son hadn't known what to make of this admission. His father had never elaborated, and the son hadn't pressed. But now, in the context of Sandra Young's murder, the statement took on a chilling new meaning. Harold Mitchell had been 18 years old when Sandra was killed. The arrest of Harold Mitchell took place on a quiet Monday morning in the spring of 2023. Investigators had spent months building their case, gathering evidence, and preparing for this moment. They knew that Harold was unlikely to confess, and they were prepared for a protracted legal battle. Harold answered the door in his bathrobe, looking confused and annoyed by the early morning intrusion. When the investigators identified themselves and explained why they were there, his expression changed. The confusion disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. For just a moment, the investigators saw a glimpse of the predator that Harold had been hiding for 55 years. Then the mask slipped back into place, and Harold became a frail, old man again, bewildered and protesting his innocence. He was transported to the county jail and processed like any other suspect. Mugshots were taken. Fingerprints were recorded. He was given an orange jumpsuit and placed in a holding cell to await his arraignment. The news of Harold's arrest spread quickly through the small town where Sandra had lived and died. For those who remembered the case, it was an earthquake, a seismic shift in the landscape of their memories. Many had assumed the killer was long dead, that justice would never be served. The revelation that he had been alive all this time, living just a few hours away, free and unpunished while Sandra lay in her grave, was almost too much to process. Sandra's younger sister, now in her early 70s, received the phone call that she had been waiting for her entire adult life. She had to sit down when the detective told her that an arrest had been made. Her hands shook so badly that she nearly dropped the phone. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're sure," the detective replied. "It's him." She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. Then she went to her closet, pulled out an old cardboard box, and began to sift through its contents. Photographs, letters, Newspaper clippings. A lifetime of memories of the sister she had lost. At the bottom of the box, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, was Sandra's senior portrait. She had died before she could graduate, but the school had taken her picture anyway, honoring her as part of the class she should have been part of. In the photograph, Sandra was smiling, her eyes bright with the confidence of youth, her whole future stretched out before her. Her sister held the photograph and wept. Harold Mitchell's trial was set for early 2024. His attorneys, as predicted, mounted an aggressive defense. They challenged the DNA evidence, arguing that the original samples had been improperly stored and that the chain of custody was suspect. They questioned the reliability of the elderly witnesses, suggesting that their memories had been corrupted by time and media exposure. They painted Harold as a convenient scapegoat, an old man being railroaded for a crime he didn't commit. But the prosecution had done its homework. Expert witnesses testified to the validity of the DNA analysis. The genealogy methodology was explained in detail, demonstrating how investigators had identified Harold as the source of the DNA on the cigarette butt. The witnesses' accounts were presented carefully, with acknowledgement of their limitations, but emphasis on their consistency and corroboration. And then there was the matter of Harold's history. The prosecution introduced evidence of Harold's prior bad acts, the assault conviction, the stalking charge, the uncharged cases that had trailed him through the decades. The defense objected, arguing that this evidence was prejudicial and irrelevant. But the judge allowed it, ruling that it established a pattern of behavior that was directly relevant to the current charges. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with members of the public, journalists, and relatives of Sandra Young who had traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. Sandra's sister was there every day, sitting in the front row, her eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her sister's life. Harold Mitchell did not take the stand in his own defense. His attorneys advised him to remain silent, knowing that cross-examination would be devastating. Instead, they relied on their attacks on the prosecution's evidence, hoping to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. It wasn't enough. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. When the forewoman read the verdict, Sandra's sister let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a cry of triumph. 55 years of waiting, of hoping, of refusing to give up, had finally led to this moment. Justice had been served. Harold Mitchell showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him. But when the bailiffs came to lead him away, he glanced over at the gallery where Sandra's family was sitting. For just a moment, his mask slipped again, and something ugly flashed in his eyes. Then he was gone, led away to await sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. Harold Mitchell, now 75 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given his age, it was unlikely that he would ever leave prison alive. But that wasn't the point. The point was accountability. The point was that Sandra Young's killer would die behind bars, his freedom stripped away, just as he had stripped Sandra of her life. In her victim impact statement, Sandra's sister addressed the court directly, speaking of the decades of pain, the holidays marked by absence, the milestones that Sandra never reached. "My sister was 17 years old," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to help people. She had so much love to give, and this man took all of that away. He took her future. He took our family's peace. He took 55 years of justice. But he couldn't take our memories of Sandra. He couldn't take our love for her. And he couldn't escape the truth forever." She paused, looking directly at Harold Mitchell. "I hope you think about Sandra every day for the rest of your life. I hope her face is the last thing you see before you close your eyes at night. And I hope you understand, finally, that the past never stays buried. The truth always finds a way to come out." In the aftermath of Harold Mitchell's conviction, the story of Sandra Young took on new dimensions. She was no longer just a victim, a name in a file, a cold case statistic. She became a symbol of persistence, of hope, of the power of never giving up. News outlets across the country picked up the story. podcasts dedicated episodes to exploring the case. True crime communities analyzed every detail, marveling at the combination of old-fashioned detective work and cutting-edge technology that had finally brought the killer to justice. But for Sandra's family, the media attention was secondary to something far more personal: healing. For 55 years, they had lived with an open wound, a question that had no answer, a crime that had no resolution. Now, at last, they could begin to heal. It wouldn't happen overnight. The trauma of Sandra's murder had shaped their lives in ways that couldn't be undone by a guilty verdict. But there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before, a feeling that Sandra's spirit could finally rest. Sandra's sister became an advocate for cold case investigations, speaking to groups across the country about the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes. She worked with legislators to secure funding for genealogy programs, helping to ensure that other families wouldn't have to wait as long as hers had for answers. She also did something deeply personal. She visited Sandra's grave for the first time in years. The cemetery was quiet on the day she arrived, the spring air soft and fragrant with flowers. Sandra's headstone was simple, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements. The inscription read, "Sandra Young, beloved daughter, sister, friend, 1951 to 1968, forever in our hearts." She knelt beside the grave and placed a bouquet of yellow roses, Sandra's favorite, at the base of the headstone. Then she began to talk, just as their mother had once talked to Sandra in her bedroom shrine. "We got him, Sandra," she said. "It took 55 years, but we got him. He's going to die in prison. He's never going to hurt anyone else." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I wish you could have seen it. The trial, the verdict, all those people who came out to support you. You had so many people who loved you, Sandra. You still do. We never forgot you. We never stopped fighting for you." She sat in silence for a long time, listening to the birds singing in the trees, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. It was peaceful here, more peaceful than she remembered. Maybe that was because the weight of uncertainty had finally been lifted. Maybe it was because Sandra's story finally had an ending. When she left the cemetery, she felt lighter than she had in years. There was still grief. There would always be grief, but it was no longer tainted by the poison of injustice. Sandra had been avenged. Her killer had been caught, and her memory would live on, not as a victim, but as a testament to the power of love and perseverance. The ripples of Sandra's case extended far beyond her own family. Across the country, cold case units were reinvigorated by the success of genealogy. Cases that had been considered unsolvable were reopened, re-examined, and in many instances, solved. Families who had given up hope began to believe again. Justice, delayed though it might be, was still possible. Harold Mitchell, meanwhile, began his life sentence in a maximum security prison. His health, already fragile, declined rapidly in the harsh prison environment. But there was no sympathy for him, not from the guards, not from his fellow inmates, not from anyone who knew what he had done. He received occasional letters from his children, brief and perfunctory, more out of obligation than affection. His grandchildren, whom he had barely known, did not write at all. The life he had built, such as it was, had crumbled around him, and he was left with nothing but the weight of his crimes and the endless hours of imprisonment. Whether he felt remorse was impossible to know. He never spoke publicly about Sandra Young, never admitted his guilt, never apologized to her family. Perhaps, in his twisted mind, he still believed he had done nothing wrong. Perhaps he was simply incapable of the self-reflection necessary for genuine remorse. It didn't matter, in the end. What mattered was that he was behind bars, paying the price for what he had done. What mattered was that Sandra's family had the closure they deserved. What mattered was that the story had an ending. But endings are rarely neat and tidy, and there was one more chapter to be written in the story of Sandra Young. In the summer of 2024, several months after Harold Mitchell's sentencing, Sandra's sister received an unexpected visitor. The woman who knocked on her door was in her 60s, with graying hair and nervous eyes. She introduced herself as Carol, and she said she had information about Sandra's case that she had never shared with anyone. Sandra's sister invited her in, curious but cautious. After everything she had been through, she had learned to be careful about people who claimed to have information. Carol sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and began to tell her story. She had been 16 years old in the year Sandra was killed, a year younger than Sandra, and she had lived on the same street. She hadn't known Sandra well. They'd traveled in different circles, but she knew who she was. Everyone did. On the night Sandra disappeared, Carol had been walking home from a friend's house. It was late, later than she was supposed to be out, and she was hurrying to beat her parents' curfew. As she turned onto her street, she saw something that had haunted her for more than 50 years. She saw a car pulled over to the side of the road, its engine running, its headlights off, and she saw a young man standing beside the car, arguing with someone in the passenger seat. The interior light was on, and Carol could see that the passenger was a girl about her own age, with brown hair styled in a flip. Carol had recognized the young man. It was Harold Mitchell, a boy she knew from school, a boy who gave her the creeps whenever she was near him. She didn't recognize the girl, but she remembered thinking that whoever she was, she looked scared. Carol had hurried past, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to get involved in whatever was happening. She'd gone home, told no one what she had witnessed, and tried to forget about it. 3 weeks later, when Sandra Young's body was found, Carol had realized with horror that the girl in the car might have been Sandra. She'd wanted to go to the police, but she was afraid. Afraid of Harold, afraid of what he might do if he knew she had seen him, afraid of getting in trouble for being out past curfew, afraid of everything. So she had said nothing. For 55 years, she had carried this secret, this terrible knowledge, and it had eaten away at her soul. She had followed the case over the decades, hoping that the killer would be caught without her help. When Harold Mitchell was finally arrested, she had felt a surge of relief, but also a crushing guilt. Her silence might have cost Sandra's family decades of uncertainty. If she had spoken up at the time, Harold might have been caught immediately. Sandra's parents might have lived to see justice served. The whole trajectory of the case might have been different. Now, at last, she had come to confess. Not to the police. Her testimony was no longer necessary for the case, but to Sandra's sister. She needed to apologize for her silence, to beg forgiveness for the years of pain that her cowardice had helped to perpetuate. Sandra's sister listened in silence. When Carol finished speaking, she sat for a long moment, processing what she had heard. Then she did something that surprised both of them. She reached out and took Carol's hand. "You were 16 years old," she said gently. "You were a child, and you were afraid. I can't blame you for that. None of us can know how we would act in that situation until we're in it." Carol began to cry. "But if I had said something, if you had said something, it might have made a difference. Or it might not have. The police made mistakes back then. The investigation was flawed in many ways. There's no guarantee that your testimony would have changed anything." She squeezed Carol's hand. "What matters is that you came forward now. What matters is that you've carried this burden for 55 years, and you're finally letting it go. That takes courage. That takes strength." Sandra would understand. I know she would. The two women sat together for a long time, bound by a tragedy that had touched both their lives. When Carol finally left, she looked lighter somehow, as if the weight of her secret had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Sandra's sister watched her go, thinking about the strange ways that trauma ripples outward, affecting lives that you would never expect. Carol had been a bystander, an accidental witness, and yet she had carried the wound of Sandra's murder for more than half a century. How many others were out there, touched by this tragedy in ways that no one knew? It was a reminder that the impact of violence extends far beyond the immediate victims. It touches families, communities, entire generations. And the only way to heal is to bring the truth to light, to acknowledge what happened, and to find a way to move forward. This is the lesson of Sandra Young's story. The truth matters. Justice matters. And it's never too late to speak up, to come forward, to break the silence that allows evil to flourish. 1 year after Harold Mitchell's conviction, Sandra Young's family held a private ceremony at the cemetery where she was buried. They gathered around her grave, the surviving siblings, their children and grandchildren, a few close friends who had known Sandra in life. and they said goodbye. Not goodbye in the sense of forgetting. They would never forget Sandra, but goodbye in the sense of release. For 55 years, they had been bound to her tragedy, defined by the unresolved nature of her death. Now, at last, they could remember her for who she had been, not just for how she had died. Sandra's sister spoke first, her voice strong and clear despite her advanced age. Sandra was more than a victim, she said. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had dreams and hopes, just like all of us. She wanted to help people. She wanted to make the world a better place. And in a way, she did. Because of her, other families have found justice. Because of her, cold case investigations have been prioritized. Because of her, people understand that the past is never truly past, that the truth will always find a way to come out. She paused, looking at the gathering around her. Harold Mitchell took 55 years of Sandra's future. But he couldn't take her legacy. He couldn't take the love we have for her. And he couldn't take our hope. We never gave up on Sandra, and because of that, she was never truly lost. One by one, the family members placed flowers on Sandra's grave. Yellow roses, her favorite. The headstone, recently cleaned and restored, gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. A new inscription had been added at the bottom. Justice served, 2024. After the ceremony, the family gathered at Sandra's sister's house for a meal. It was the first time in years that they had all been together, the first time in even longer that they had been able to talk about Sandra without the shadow of injustice hanging over them. They shared stories, laughed at old memories, and toasted to Sandra's memory. The youngest member of the family, a great niece who had never known Sandra but had grown up hearing stories about her, asked a question that brought silence to the room. "Do you think she's at peace now?" the girl asked. "Do you think she knows that we caught him?" Sandra's sister smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I believe she does," she said. "I believe that wherever Sandra is, she knows that we never gave up on her. She knows that we fought for her until the very end. And I believe that she's proud of us, just as we're proud of her." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, the kind of sunset that makes you believe in the possibility of new beginnings. The kind of sunset that Sandra Young would never see. But her family saw it, and in that moment, they felt her presence with them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature, a peace that had been 55 years in the making. Sandra Young was 17 years old when she died. She never got to become a nurse, never got to hold the hands of frightened patients, never got to live the life she had dreamed of. But her memory lived on in the hearts of those who loved her. And in the end, that's a kind of immortality. Harold Mitchell would die alone in prison, unmourned and unforgiven. But Sandra Young would be remembered forever, not as a victim, but as a symbol of hope, of perseverance, of the unbreakable bonds of love. This is the story of Sandra Young. It's a story of tragedy and triumph, of darkness and light, of a 55-year journey toward justice. It's a story that reminds us that the truth is worth fighting for, that the dead deserve to be heard, and that it's never too late for redemption. Because in the end, Sandra Young did get her justice. Her killer was caught. Her family found peace. And her spirit, finally, was set free. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of persistence and the possibility of justice, then do something for Sandra. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Help carry her voice forward so that her story can inspire others who are still waiting, still hoping, still fighting for the truth. Sandra waited 55 years for someone to tell her story. Don't make her wait another moment to be heard. For Sandra Young, for her family, for all the victims whose stories are still waiting to be told, may they all find peace.